Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 26th of June, and today we'll be talking about the situation in Zaporozhye and then talk about the audio recording that was released by Prigozhin and the speech that was given by Putin and the implications that it will have for Wagner and for Russia in general. Let's begin by looking at the front line, where the only change is that the Ukrainian forces took over the town of Rivnopil. Rivnopil, you could see, it's a town with really only two roads spanning through it. I could count the number of houses in this town on one or two fingers. So it is a relatively small town. What matters is that Russia has some forward positions over here that were adjacent to some Ukrainian positions, such as Novodarivka or Storozheve, Makarivka, Laudatne, and Skuchne, all of these different towns. And so this was really Russia's most forward, most northernmost position in this entire Vermivka bulge or Vermivka salient, you could say. And so now the Ukrainians have been able to finally push the Russians out of this forward town where they had some of their men stationed, and those men have been forced to retreat towards the town of Pryutine, which is a bit to the south. And this means that the road to some of the Russian towns, the Russian controlled towns that are around the Mokoli Yari River. I think that's what the river is called. Let's zoom in on the river actually. So the river is called the Mokryali River. And so the Russians, they do have some towns under their control adjacent to the river on both sides, including towns such as Storomayorske or Rozhenie, which have been attacked consistently by the Ukrainians since the beginning of their attacks on the Vermivka axis. And so now there's no towns in between the Ukrainian forces and the Russian forces on the northwestern flank, you could say. And there aren't really any paved roads besides one over here, actually. This one over here. So there's a singular road that the Ukrainians can utilize to reach Storomayorske from this point, from the northwestern flank. And they could also use all of these open fields, obviously. It also means that the Ukrainians are beginning to clear out the salient, and they may try to conduct sort of this two-pronged attack to make the bulge very difficult to hold on to by advancing from Levadne, which they've been trying to do for a couple of days now. They were able to make some gains yesterday. They advanced about 1 kilometer to the east of Levadne, but they have been stopped short of reaching the town of Pryutine. So it's a part of their objectives in this area to push from Levadne deeper to the east. And then at the same time, the Ukrainians already have this bulge over here. You can see just to the east of Urozhenie and the Mokryali River. And so you can see how the Ukrainians are trying to attack on two flanks, try to squeeze the Russians out of their forward positions over here, and then advance towards the first major Russian lines of defense. And part of this entire operation includes taking over the town of Storomlinivka. Storomlinivka is a local supply hub. It's a local road junction, I would say, that you need to pass through if you're a Russian, like a Russian trying to supply forces to the front line. If you're trying to reach the front line with reinforcements or resupply, then you need to go through Storomlinivka, because you could see how many paved roads, because what's important is the paved roads, which are better for more volume and for better types of equipment, larger types of equipment. You need to go through Storomlinivka for that. You can see how they have several roads that are branching to the north on both the eastern and the western side of the river, and some minor roads that connect towns like Volodine, and then from there to other towns around the entire salient, which is spanning this entire circle over here. And so it's important that Ukraine take over Staromlinivka for themselves, first of all, if they want to continue pushing to the south towards the Russian defensive lines, which I have roughly mapped out as around this black line over here. So if they want to reach that position, then they need to have control over some road junctions that will allow them to advance through paved roads into some of the towns that need to be taken over, but also to deny Russia access to these road junctions if they were to still hold some forward positions in a town like Pryutine. It would be much harder for the Russians to hold on to this town if they were isolated from a key road junction supply hub such as Staroblinivka. So that's why the Ukrainians are aiming for this town in the longer term. So that's it in terms of the front line. There's not much else to say, but I would like to talk about the situation in regards to a new Wagner base that is being built in Belarus. And so this comes after the entire saga with the Wagner comms advancing onto Rostov and in the direction of Moscow. A part of the agreement, which I'm going to get into, which was confirmed by both Prigozhin and Putin, is that the Wagner Group will continue their operations in Belarus and I assume also in places like Africa. And so in Belarus, there's reports now that a new base is being constructed in the town of Osipovsky, which is in the Mogilev region of Belarus, and it's also close to the major city of Babruysk. It's about 200 kilometers away from the front line with Ukraine in the Kiev Oblast. Here's the line generally. And so you can't really directly launch an attack from this base. This is a very deep lying base. I guess it's going to be like Wagner's rear, where they're connected to a lot of the key industrial cities in Belarus, a lot of the key supply hubs. And this town, Osipvochi, it is pretty small in comparison to some other major cities in Belarus, but it does seem like a good area to set up a military base because there is a rail station that runs through here and spans out in multiple different directions. So you do have this rail hub over here. There's also obviously a lot of roads that branch out from the specific town. There's also a lot of forested areas over here for different drills that can be conducted. There's also some open areas too. I read that the base is supposed to be something like 24,000 square meters in size, so that would be on the outskirts of this town, presumably. And it will have a capacity of 8,000 men. And so Wagner, it was estimated to have 25 to 50,000 men, although I'm leaning towards the 25,000 men number. And so there's more bases that will be built in addition to this one. And maybe some of those will be closer to the front line with Ukraine. Because the implication is that the Wagner Group will be sent to man the border between Belarus and Ukraine, which could divert some Ukrainian attention away from their counteroffensives in multiple different directions and from their counterattacks in Bakhmut, for instance, or their attempts at probing in Kherson, because they're already stretched out in a lot of these different directions. They may have to send some of their men, like territorial defense units, that are being used really as the vanguard in certain attacks, like in Zaporozhye, back to the border with Belarus, where they were stationed at the beginning of the war, just in order to ensure that the Wagner Group doesn't launch an offensive. Look, the thing is, you can't really launch an offensive from the north with 8,000 men. First of all, Belarus is not in a mode to supply this offensive. They don't have the war economy up and going yet to supply something like that. And the thing is, now all of the area in northern Kiev to the north of Kiev is extremely fortified. Definitely, if the Wagner Group were to try to attack in this direction, immediately all the roads and the bridges would be destroyed. The dam in, what's it called? In Visherod, if somehow the Wagner Group even reached that far, then it would be blown up again, which would slow down and bog down their advance like it did for the Russians in the beginning of the war. And you have to also recognize the fact that in a lot of these forested areas, there's really not that many good roads for a mechanized assault. And it's just so far away from Russia's main supply lines that I can't see how the Wagner Group would do this on their own. They've always relied on the support of the Russian Ministry of Defense, whether it be for ammo or for supplies or artillery strikes, in order to conduct their advances in a place like Bakhmut. And that was a part of why Prigozhin even got mad at the Ministry of Defense in the first place. So I don't see any sort of offensive from this direction as being likely, but I do see it as a way to protect Belarus and as a way to man the border and divert some Ukrainian attention. There's also talks that I heard of that the Wagner Group would be sent to the border with Poland, which could be very interesting. It could lead to Poland mobilizing more of its forces, even like countries like Lithuania calling for a increase in mobilization if that were to occur. And so I would expect that there would be a very strong and negative reaction from NATO and from the West in general if that were to happen. And so that is a part of Wagner's future plans for the members of Wagner that wish to continue with the organization. And so let's move on to Putin's speech now, or actually to Prigozhin's speech, where he clarified the situation that occurred on the 23rd, 24th, where the Wagner group entered Russian territory with columns towards Moscow. And he sort of explained his rationale for all of that. So I'm going to try to summarize what he said in his speech to the best of my ability. So Prigozhin was actually pretty silent after the events transpired. And only today did he really break his silence after a few days of being offline from Telegram, for instance. And he explained his rationale. So what he was saying is that essentially Wagner was set to be dissolved on the 1st of July because really most of the mercenaries, and I don't even think Prigozhin himself, they didn't even want to sign a new contract with the MOD. The Russian Ministry of Defense, they were basically forcing any sort of mercenary group to sign new contracts with the Russian Ministry of Defense, which would take away from their operational independence. And so because most of the men didn't agree to that, then it would essentially cause the mercenary group to not be recognized anymore as an entity in Russia. And so through that, it would not be able to project any sort of power or any sort of military display within Ukraine. And so it was in a peril, the entire organization. And so this was a matter of survival for Prigozhin's entire business. And so Prigozhin says that he originally intended to hand over his vehicles to the Russian Ministry of Defense. And he would do that on June 30th in Rostov. That all of that plan changed when the Russian Ministry of Defense attacked his base around Bakhmut, a bit to the east, closer to the rear. So apparently Prigozhin was accusing the Russian Ministry of Defense of launching this missile attack onto their base, which he says killed 30 men and injured many more. And that's what really triggered his response. So he's saying that he was willing to give up his equipment to the Russian Ministry of Defense and willing to come up with this peaceful resolution until he was attacked by them. That's his excuse. And there was one video that I talked about when the entire event was unfolding, but that video wasn't really conclusive in showing any sort of major destruction to a Wagner base. So there's no proof of anything like that happening. Now, he says that one column was sent to Rostov and one was sent to Moscow as a response. And he says that he feels bad for firing onto the Russian aviation because, there were certain Russian helicopters and Russian planes that were firing onto the column. And by now there's a lot of footage coming out. There's footage from Voronezh, for instance, of certain fighting, of certain actions like shelling, and there's a lot of mines that were placed all over the place. So we do know to a certain extent there was some fighting, although it wasn't really significant. As I said in my videos talking about these situations, the Russians really only suffered about 15 dead from all of this, and that was mainly just from the planes and the helicopters being shot down, which we do have photos and videos from after the scene of people on the ground taking photos of these helicopters and that one IL-22 being shot down. So there was a debris from that. And so he says that he didn't intend for there to be people killed due to this entire situation, but that it was a means of self-defense because a lot of these air assets were actually firing onto his columns. So that was his justification. But he says that his objective with this entire operation, which he called the March for Justice, it was to save Wagner and then also to hold the higher-ups in Ministry of Defense accountable. He said this was never intended to be a coup. That's what he said. He never meant to overthrow the government. And he says that Wagner eventually decided to stop advancing onto Moscow due to a fear of bloody battles breaking out. And he thought that their actions of, taking over the entirety of Rostov, pushing with a column within 200 kilometers of Moscow, that was enough of a message that could be sent to Putin into the Ministry of Defense. And that was enough of a protest, and that it didn't need to escalate even further into any sort of battle. And so He then said that Lukashenko, he offered a satisfactory solution by allowing Wagner to continue their operations outside of Russia in Belarus. And so he accepted that offer, and then now you have the situation with the base being built that I talked about previously. But Prigozhin did stress in his speech that the internal security of the Russian Federation is incredibly compromised, especially in a lot of military bases in airfields. A lot of them were very unprotected, in that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to protect a lot of these internal assets that are extremely important to Russia. He also says that the Russian forces should be modeled based off of Wagner strategies, and that if they were, then they would have been successful in taking over Ukraine on the first day of the war, because he explained how he was able to make all these rapid gains within Russia, advancing 700 kilometers in all directions in 24 hours or less. So that's the gist of what he was saying. Then Putin, he also released his own statement to the Russian people, and it was a short 5-minute speech, and most of it was platitudes from what I heard, but he did have some key points. He did say that attempts at causing internal instability would be crushed, and so he was trying to come off with this persona that he was still strongman. He also says that the organizers of the entire events, and when he says that, he's obviously alluding to Prigozhin. He says that they betrayed the country and lied to the people in Wagner, led to the men in Wagner, and by doing so, he pitted Russian against Russian, which caused a lot of division. I might actually open up his speech for everyone so you can just hear for yourself what he has to say. But I'll try to summarize it to the best that I can while he's speaking. And so he says that the West and the Ukrainians, they wanted Russia to fight, and so they were sort of cheering on this division, but that they failed in causing the situation to escalate. He said that most Wagner men are patriots, as was proved in Donbass, and so he was willing to take steps to avoid bloodshed instead of escalating the situation. And so he gave Wagner the chance to change their minds about escalating by reaching Moscow, and so he was able to come to this resolution peacefully without fighting. And then he says, again, trying to reinforce this narrative that Russia is united and that his grip on power is strong. He said that the reason why stability was achieved is due to the civil service unity in Russia. And so he's trying to, increase the morale and try to assert this idea that Russia is still very stable. And so, as a result of all this fiasco, he says that Wagner have three choices. Either they have to sign the new contracts with the MOD, so that rule didn't change, or that they have to go home to their families, or that they could go and join Prigozhin in Belarus. So those are the three choices. And so this would confirm what Prigozhin was saying before. It also makes me think that it wasn't coordinated beforehand by Putin and Prigozhin, because of the way they're talking, it seems like there actually was a legitimate dispute, and that Prigozhin did have legitimate concerns that he had with MOD and with the situation facing Wagner. And I don't think that the best way of going about fixing those problems would be by really causing such a public spectacle. I think that if it actually was a coordination between Putin and Prigozhin, there would have been much more simple ways of coming to a resolution, and that Wagner would have still been allowed to stay in Russia. But we see that they're not allowed to stay in Russia. They're being forced to go to Belarus or just go home. And so this doesn't mean that Wagner is totally powerless. Wagner is definitely still a force to be reckoned with, and they're going to have their own facilities in Belarus, which I think will be significant in the future. We're going to have to wait and see what happens there. Also, we can't forget that they have a huge amount of influence in Africa, especially in the Sahel region, which is just to the south of the Sahara, with a lot of those countries over there. So I'm going to go back for a second to that. I'm going to go back to the map of Africa just to show what's going on over there. So the Wagner Group, they have a lot of support from governments in countries such as the Central African Republic. In Sudan, they have operations going on. In Chad, they're being involved. In Libya, they're trying to protect oil fields from exporting their hydrocarbons to the EU. In Mali, they have significant support. In Burkina Faso, they also have support. In the Ivory Coast as well. So you'll see how they're popping up over all of the Sahel region in Africa. And they are doing the bidding of the Russians in a way, but they're still benefiting themselves, obviously. They're getting control over oil fields, oil supplies. They're getting control of gold mines, uranium mines. And this will help Russia's regional power projection, and it could also help China's power projection in a way as well. If there's coordination between China's entire operations in Africa, because, they have the Belt and Road Initiative, then you could see some sort of cooperation where Wagner allows China to exert more influence into areas in sub-Saharan Africa or in the Sahel region. So that's something that could also happen in the future. And so Wagner is still an important force that will allow Russia to project power globally. So you can't forget about them. So they're still going to be relevant. But I really do think that all in all, we're going to have to see what happens with the Ministry of Defense. I think that there were some reports from Rybar stating that there might actually be a shift and a change to the leadership. Although this is still unconfirmed because I haven't seen any elaboration or update on that situation, there is the possibility that Putin will make some significant changes to the leadership there, according to Rybar at least. And so that's all for the situation in Ukraine and Russia. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.